Hey everybody, today we're here to talk about Age of Wonders 4. In particular, we're here to talk about the Chaos Affinity Tomes. If you hear Kitty in the background, that's because she thinks we're here to talk about Kitty all day, and she has been interrupting this video every time I try to make it by either meowing loudly to demand I open the window, or just meowing loudly to get my attention, or pawing at a box for some reason, or playing loudly with her toy. If you hear her, pretend she doesn't exist. This is life with a Siamese. So at any rate, we're going to do a discussion and a tier list video on the Chaos Affinity Tomes. Now, the two ones I haven't gone over so far are Chaos Affinity and Astral Affinity. That's because I don't really play them that much, because I don't like mages, so I don't like Astral Affinity. And Chaos Affinity, I actually played a lot back when I was newer to the game, but I just kind of found that a lot of what Chaos does is just not really strong enough to work in practical application. So as always, this is going to be a tier list and a discussion video, but I think that the discussion is far more valuable than the tier list. If you want to see the tier list, just go to the end of the video. As always, we're going to do an introduction, but I'll try to get through it much quicker than I've done in the previous times. This is going to be largely a discussion video, so if you want to just listen along, then, you know, I can make the pictures move across the screen as much as I can to keep you guys interested. If you are just interested by looking at the stats and numbers and all that, then you are the level of nerd that will continue to watch these videos, and I appreciate you a lot. If not, you can use this as a podcast or just put it on your TV while you do other stuff, just listen along. That's fine too. Saying this increases viewer engagement, ironically, which increases me in the algorithm. Additionally, make sure to like and subscribe because it will benefit you, but most importantly, benefit me a lot. And that's what this is all about, isn't it? But in all seriousness, I kind of have to do that because that's just how YouTube works. If I say that, then you guys do it, then YouTube thinks it's a better video. I know I say this every time, but it's because I feel bad about doing it because I don't really like doing it. I actually read an article. A little bit ago that a lot of male brains respond more positively towards being told what to do instead of being told what not to do. So do subscribe to me. That is a good thing. So let's talk about Chaos Affinity Tomes. Overall, let's talk about Tomes as a whole, so we have everyone at a base level here, right? Tomes in Age of Wonders 4 are mostly about creating a tech tree. You're trying to create a tech tree in the game using your different tomes. So these are all the different, I'm going to call it technologies that you can unlock. The stronger the technologies that you can unlock, the better. Additionally, a lot of tomes tend to have buildings in them, and these buildings can give you large benefits. Chaos tomes tend to, for some reason, not really have buildings in them, or at the very least not have really good buildings in them. And this will be a common recurring problem with Chaos Affinity, and why, despite the fact that it kind of should be good, it's kind of not. We're not going to talk about the affinity track and how useful getting Chaos Affinity is. We'll save that for a different video, but let's start talking about these tomes right now. So first up, we have Tome of Pyromancy, one of the most goodiest, okayest tomes in the game. So Chaos Affinity kind of gets slammed by the color pie, if you want to call it that. So as with Magic the Gathering in a lot of games, each different color kind of does different things and specializes in different things. Chaos specializes in nothing, really. Some of their buildings tend to be foresters, which, you know, foresters are fine. One of them is a carnival of flesh to be a farm. Farms aren't really good. Foresters aren't really that good either. So the buildings here in Chaos Tomes tend to not really be that good. Additionally, the color pie of Chaos gives it, well, I'm not really sure what it does give it, because it sure isn't a lot. Right here in Tome of Pyromancy, we can see the Pit Ritual Pyre. This is the building you get for unlocking this tome. It's a forester, which isn't really that good. That gives mana, which we don't really care about until late game, because we'll generally get enough mana throughout the game that we don't really need it from buildings. Then we get more mana per adjacent forester. As I've mentioned, we don't really want foresters, and we certainly don't want a lot of mana, so this is certainly not an interesting building that will not be strong in any way. Let's talk about the positives of Tome of Pyromancy then, before I kind of go a bit into its negatives. It is still a decent tome for 2 reasons. We get Searing Blades, which reduces the physical damage we deal by 2, but gives us 4 more fire damage. This specializes our melee units, affects units all melee down here. This specializes our melee units in doing a lot of fire damage. Then, if an enemy is burning, we get an additional 20% damage modifier, which will be pretty easy to proc as the game starts progressing. The second reason is fiery arrows. If we're using archers, which we probably won't be using that much of after the early game, but if we are, our archers can do +2 fire damage and -1 physical damage, specializing them more in, fire damage. Then we get a 60% chance of afflicting burning. Having an archer in your stacks in the early game can burn enemies, which then procs Searing Blades, bonus damage. These 2 are pretty good, but mostly it's just Searing Blades. Searing Blades is just really good. The spells here are, I mean, it's a tier 1 tome, so once again, we're kind of going to be having the issue with a lot of these spells in tier 1 tomes are just not really going to be that applicable until late game, and certainly Tome of Pyromancy is no exception. Now, this is a damage spell that can help you in the early game if you unlock it, but will only hit 1 enemy. That enemy takes 25 fire damage, is afflicted with burning, and then the ground under them is set on fire. It's a decent enough spell in the early game for burning enemies, especially that might stay alive for a turn or 2. Maybe if you're fighting a higher tier enemy in a camp or something, if you're playing out a battle, so you can kind of stack up the burning dot on them. It's also pretty good for lighting an enemy on fire right before you hit them with Searing Blades to kind of get a lot of damage. It's only 10 mana, which isn't a little, but it's not that much. Uses 15 combat casting points, so certainly will not be useful until late game. Remember that combat casting points is it's the allowance of spells you're allowed to cast, whereas mana is how much it actually uses from you. So 15 combat casting points is actually kind of a lot for a single target nuke. But, you know, of a single target nuke, it's certainly not a bad one. It actually can be a pretty good one, and it can help you in the early game. Then we have Immolate, which is the other spell. Enemy units in a 1 hex radius take 10 fire damage, then an additional 15 fire damage if they are burning. This can actually be somewhat useful into the mid game to get pretty decent AoE nukes on enemies. It won't scale that amazingly, but again, this is a tier 1 tome. Now, of spells here, we do of course see the issue. And in a lot of these videos, I do hope you guys listen to the discussion, because I think the discussion can tell you whether or not a tome is good. You know, going into the future, there might be balance changes, there might be game changes, things like that, and it can just generally be really useful to understand why a tome is good and why a tome is bad. I had some guy put in the comments on my other video, and I do read all the comments, so if you ever leave a comment, I will read it. I had one guy put in the comments that one reason that he thinks a lot of these tomes can be good or bad is based on whether or not they allow you to scale better, and whether or not they actually do stuff for you after the early game fights, and that's true. Immolate can be pretty good in the early game, but doesn't really scale that well. The better tier 1 tomes can have spells that do scale pretty well, including, well, if we look at the tomes that just generally give us damage, I hate to always compare it again, but once again, we got the Tome of Zeal with Inspiring Chant, which scales pretty decently and it can be pretty powerful. And then over here in Tome of Nature, with the Tome of Roots, we have another tome that gives us damage on hit, and this one gives us Vine Prison. So this is why I consider this tome to kind of be, it's decent, because it's giving us the same on-hit damage the other on-hit damage tomes will do, but it's not really giving us much beyond that, other than a pretty decent spell for winning early game fights. It also certainly is not giving us a good building. So let's look at its 2 units then. It's summon, and then its unit that it deploys. The summon for this tome is firmly fine. Not really that good, but fine. It does a kind of low 9 damage on hit, but that's pure magic damage, and it does apply burning, so that's decent at least. It's got a 50 HP, 0-2. Most battle mages are stat very squishily, so this is about average for battle mage. It's just battle mages tend to not really be that useful to begin with, and ironically, this tome doesn't even buff battle mages, it buffs archers, which is kind of funny when you think about it. Its abilities are Fiery Wake, which ignites any terrain it walks over, which is really not that amazing. It's immune to burning because it's made of burning, and then of course it has Vengeful Flames. When an enemy hits this unit in melee, they take 2 fire damage and have a 30% chance of being afflicted with burning. That chance of being afflicted by burning is not really that high, and if this unit gets hit in melee, it's generally and probably going to die. It, of course, is one of these evolving elemental units that, if you manage to get to legendary, can become a magma spirit. Magma spirits are firmly decent units. They're a tier 3 battle mage. They're non-racial, of course, because they're a spirit, a magma spirit, and they're firmly okay as well. I wouldn't call them good, I wouldn't call them bad, I'd call them fine. So the elemental is fine for just an early game summon. I've also used it in early game PvP fights to just have an extra range source of burning to deal with tankier enemies. So it does have its purposes. It's a fine unit. It's good to have a summon in your roster, and this one's not really that bad at all. Now, of course, we go into the units from this tome. I said not the units, the singular unit. We'll notice the same problem as always. This is a tier 2 unit, and tier 2 units are generally the least useful tier of units. Tier 1 units are cheap, and you can give them a lot of veterancy from buildings. So the advantage of tier 1 units is you can quickly get to 18 units if you want to fight a big battle against another player or AI or anything like that. And they're cheap, low upkeep. You can build them very quickly. Tier 3 units have the advantage that they will generally fill out an 18 stack with high quality, good damaging units that will still scale pretty decently. Tier 2 units are the middle ground. They're not cheap, you can't spam them out, but they also don't scale that good. So tier 2 units are only really useful as kind of a tempo unit that you unlock the ability to build tier 2 units at your throne city probably, and then you try to build a bunch of them, but because they're not really that easy to draft, you can't build them that easy, and then they don't scale that well. Even if you do get them in your army, you can't really rush an 18 stack of tier 2 units. Realistically, tier 2 units just have it the worst. The developers might want to look into tier 2 units at some point. But of tier 2 units, the Pyromancer is probably not too bad. They recently got a balance change where the cooldown of Flame Strike was changed from 2 to 1. Now the cooldown is how many turns you have to not be casting it. So cooldown 1 ability means you have to, well, cast it, then not cast it for 1 turn, then you can cast it again. Pyromancer got that buff, and then they also got the buff where they can become a cavalry unit. So Pyromancers are, of the tier 2 spellcasters, probably the least bad. I'm going to call it like that. Flame Strike lights the ground on fire for 2 turns, and on a cooldown where you can cast it every 2 turns, Pyromancers, even 1 or 2 in the back, can just be quite devastating for your enemy, as especially early in the game when dots matter a lot, this can just stack up a lot of damage on enemies if the Pyromancer doesn't die, and as a single unit sitting in the back, this just gives them a lot of power over the early game battles. Their Firebolts does a frankly bizarrely low amount of damage. I'm not really sure why. Even 10 damage would be low, but it's not even 10, it's 8. 12 would probably be about right, but maybe that would make it step on the toes of archers. But at any rate, 8 is certainly a bit too low. Fortunately, they can flame strike every other turn now, so they're actually pretty good at battlefield control and just generally doing a lot of damage throughout the battle. And of course, because flame strike is a 90% chance of applying burning and will burn any enemy who ends their turn on the fire or walks through the fire, this is really actually good at applying to your flame weapons and just generally being really, really annoying for enemies to deal with because it's just sitting in the back doing so much damage. But again, the problem is, if we're at tier 3 units, I'd rather have 18 tier 3 units just on the battlefield, the highest tier being the strongest. If we're in an early game fight, then I probably built a bunch of tier 1 units to afford the upkeep and afford being able to actually build them in time, the tier 1 units. So tier 2 units just do not really work in the current game that well and are just a bit weak. But again, of the tier 2 units, the Pyromancer is like the least bad, I would say. He's the most used, I would say, because they are just generally pretty good. So that's a Tome of Pyromancy. It's a firmly okay tome, mostly just because of Searing Blades, to be real, which we'll also get into later. It synergizes with my favorite tome, but it's a totally fine tome. It won't be bad for picking, but it just generally can run into issues where Again, a lot of times it just questions like, why would you take this tome if you could just take a better tome? Which is, yeah. Tome of the Horde is probably one of the better tomes in the game for a reason that a lot of people don't really like, which is funny, but I'll get into it in a second. Its building is Mob Camp, another forester that was probably better earlier on, I'll say, in the game's history, but now is not as useful as it ever was. So the meta has changed from spamming tier 1 units and taking fights with enemies, either AI or players, to kind of just power farming and then trying to get out a good stack of 18 units. So this building here is not a bad building, but its main thing is it's a forester that gives you food and draft, allowing you to... Mainly it's a draft that's useful. It's not even that much draft though. But it reduces the cost of tier 1 units by 20%, allowing you to build a lot of tier 1 units pretty quickly and getting up to that 18 stack. So this building is actually pretty good for early game tempo plays and just generally winning in the early game. But as the game goes on, it does less and less. And having a forester that's only giving 7 food, 7 draft is not really that good. It's not bad to have it, but it's not, compared to a lot of other buildings, it's just not that good. And again, we have a forester, which is just like, who wants a forester? So the main use of this tome is Spawnkin, which a lot of people don't like because it makes your entire race smaller. People don't like being small. I don't like being small. It's actually just kind of unfun to make your entire race small. It can be funny if you do like really small goblins or ogres or something, but you know, like if I'm doing orcs or something, I don't want tiny orcs. But it is very, very powerful. It increases the number of units in a formation, which makes you split damage quicker and get AoE'd a bit harder. Meaning that if you go from 4 units in a formation to 6 units in a formation, the more units that die based on the percent, so let's say I had 5 units, every 20% health that my formation took, my squad took, my unit took, that would reduce my damage by 20%, because each 20% I'm dropping 1 out of the 5 units. But if I have a reduced amount of units in a formation, that effect doesn't occur as much. So this does mean that you will get AoE'd harder, and this does mean that you're a bit more susceptible to, well, again, AoEs. The advantages, though, are pretty clear. You do 20% more damage on all your regular units. Your hero units get 10% evasion, which is really not that big a deal. This 20% damage means any unit that's not being AoE'd or any unit that's at full health does a lot more damage. And generally, this damage will offset the amount of units in the formation anyway. So Spawnkin is a very large damage multiplier. Now remember, damage multipliers in this game are kind of rare and very powerful. Spawnkin is just a very powerful modifier. It just tends to not get used that much because people don't want to make their race small because that's just not cool. Okay. So we have summon irregulars, and you might notice the theme of this tome is rushing people early game. We have summon irregulars that summons a random non-scout tier 1 unit that can be produced in a city on target hex. Now this is a very interesting summon because it costs 60-60. Other summons also cost 60-60, but it will summon a racial unit for no extra price. Racial units will generally outperform non-racial units, so this gives you a more powerful summon. In addition to that, it will generally not count it as a magic origin unit, so you can get some buffs there if you reduce the upkeep of non-magic origin units through some things like that. So if I'm playing, for example, Barbarian, this could summon either my warrior or my Sunderer into my army. It's a pretty powerful spell, actually. It's great for tempo plays, and it's great for keeping you in the early game, especially when you've got good traits on your race, and generally your race is going to be pretty strong. So Spawnkin is good, Summon Irregulars is good. Summon Irregulars doesn't really scale, but it's just really strong in the early game. Blaze of the Horde used to be much stronger, but got nerfed pretty hard. It's now target enemy unit suffers 20 fire damage, and then 5 additional fire damage for each adjacent friendly unit. On average, I'd wager, if you're using this spell, you're probably going to have 3 adjacent people at best. So it'll be about 35 fire damage, which is still pretty decent, but not exactly that amazing anymore. And it certainly doesn't scale very good. Let's talk about this before we move on to the unit type. Fury of the Horde is a spell you can use in combat. All friendly tier 1 units get strengthened. So this is actually, once again, if you're trying to rush into another player, this is a pretty strong spell for giving your entire board, if you want to call it that, strengthened. So if I brought 15 tier 1 units into a battle, or if I brought summons or anything like that, they will all get strengthened. Strengthened is 10% more damage, and of course it stacks. So you can cast this 2 times in a row, or stack it with other forms of strengthened, and it can get really strong. So a whole tome is about tempoing people out in the early game. Its siege project is there, I guess. At the start of the battle, you get 6 Warhound units on the attacker's side. This doesn't deal damage to the enemy, other than giving you a lot of Warhounds to deal damage with, and it doesn't make the siege faster, but 6 Warhounds can be really good for winning early game sieges, especially if you want to mitigate the damage to your army. Other than that, it's fine, I guess. I mean, it's not a bad siege project. It's certainly one of the better ones. It's just generally I don't really care about siege projects. Not really. If I'm going to use siege projects, I'm either probably going to use the generic ones, or I can just use ones from later tomes that actually just win battles. Now, of course, that brings us to the Houndmaster. The Houndmaster is a pretty actually good unit. He did get nerfed a bunch, but he does have a unique ability here, where Unleash the Hounds. Now, this unit does need to be built in a city. You can't summon him, and he is tier 2. But he does have the unique thing where he summons a Warhound, which is a tier 1 unit. Now, these Warhounds will then get all the buffs of being tier 1 units, and will give you an additional unit in a battle. So the Houndmaster can quickly overwhelm enemies. If you have 2, 3, 4, 5 of them in your army, you can quickly overwhelm enemies by just having a much stronger action economy. The Warhound itself will mark enemy units and sunder their defense. Marking reduces their evasion, and sunder defense reduces, well, their defense. Then the Houndmaster himself has weak point shot. This is a single target hit, so it can't be used multiple times, obviously. That deals 25% more damage if an enemy is marked. So a Houndmaster is actually a pretty strong unit for rushing, and he cannot triple shot his attack, but he doesn't need all 3 actions for it, and he can constantly reposition to either get flanking shots or to hit new targets. And well, obviously if an enemy is weak, this makes it do 25 damage, which is pretty hard hitting. So the Houndmaster is just generally a good unit. He did get nerfed a while back, but I would still call him generally he's a totally good unit. So this does make the Tome of the Horde a pretty good tome for rushing. In fact, probably the best tome for rushing, other than maybe one of the Astral ones, which we'll talk about later. The problem with the Tome of the Horde is tier 1 rushing is really not the play anymore. You mostly want to build up your army and then you know, just power farm hero levels and camps to build up your cities through the spoils. The upside is Tome of the Horde is still good at that, actually. Between Spawnkin and Summon Irregulars, actually you can keep your army in the field with much better units, and Spawnkin scales actually really good for a tier 1 effect. So Tome of the Horde, I would actually say, is probably one of the better tier 1 tomes in the game right now. Just because it's pretty good, actually. It scales pretty good, and it's still pretty good in the early game. And sorry, I just realized I did something in my tier list wrong with Tome of the Horde. So now we corrected that. Okay, so Tome of the Horde is a pretty good tome, I'd say. People just generally don't like making their race small. Now this brings us to Tome of Evolution. We did talk about this when we went over the nature tomes. The problem with Tome of Evolution, and even the more I talk about Tome of Evolution, the more I hate it, because I just generally think it's just really bad, actually. So we're a tier 1 tome. We don't have any building, no building at all. It couldn't even give us a jank forest or anything like that. We just have no building. But to be fair, some tier 1 buildings are so bad they might as well not exist anyway. We've got Youthful Regeneration, which heals 1 unit for 18 hit points and gives them strengthened. If that unit has Evolve, it has those effects doubled, and then it gets Resurgence. This can be decently strong in Evolution units, but Evolution units are not really that good to begin with, and certainly don't scale. But if you are doing an Evolution build, this spell is pretty strong. I would say In all honesty, that's probably the strongest part of the tome. It's just that you can drop a 36 heal Resurgence double strengthened onto any evolved unit. That's probably the best part of the tome in its entirety. Now, of course, if we look over these units, and we did look over them before, but, you know, I guess let's look over them again. I misclicked right there. We have the, I think this actually, yeah, it actually puts it in here, which is kind of funny. No, it does not. Okay, sometimes finding this stuff can be a bit more difficult than you'd like. Where are beasts? Okay, you know what? It doesn't matter. We'll just look for Slither. Slither Hatchling. I'm very good at this. I'm good at my job. Slither Hatchling is a skirmishing unit that's actually pretty good at being a skirmishing unit. It has above average damage, 12 for a tier 1 unit, which is pretty good. A lot of skirmishers have above average damage, and this one also does as well. Additionally, if an enemy is poisoned, he deals 20% more damage to them, which does work well because his ranged attack poisons enemy. Slither is probably the strongest aspect of this tome, just because we have a low maintenance skirmisher that doesn't seem to actually have any downsides. Normally low maintenance units have some bad effect about them. Other than this unit being non-racial, there's really no bad effect here. It doesn't have any downsides. All it does is it doesn't have huge upsides. Racial units will generally have good trades buffing them. This is a non-racial unit, but it seems to actually be pretty good. Even if it did have low stats from being non-racial, it has low maintenance here, reducing its upkeep, allowing you to get a good chunk of them. Now, it does evolve into the Slither itself, which, despite looking like a big beast, really doesn't actually get... I mean, he's obviously way better than the Slither Hatchling, but for a tier 3 unit, it's firmly okay. Traits at tier 3 start mattering a bit more. It still does do a lot of damage. It has a 100% chance to poison instead of the 90% here, so that's pretty good. The range poke can be really good. We do a lot of magic damage here. We still get that venom. So Slithers would be pretty good if magical units were way better. Oh man, this one just gets slip away by default too. Both of them have low maintenance, so Slither Hatchling is pretty good here. But then that brings us to the Wyvern Fledgling, which is a fighter unit that, I mean, you notice the comparison to the Slither, right? We only have a melee attack that does only 12 damage, none of it magical. It doesn't get any bonus effect. It has no ranged attack, and that's it. That's the entire Wyvern Hatchling. This unit, as far as summons go, it's decently tanky, I guess. It's 60 HP, which is decent for a summon, but a lot of times summons are just used to die. You just replace units that are dying as you expand around the map. The Wyvern the Wyvern Fledgling isn't really supposed to die. It's supposed to evolve into a full-fledged Wyvern. And the problem here is summons aren't really used to evolve, they're used to die. Slowly, or hopefully not at all, but generally it's accepted that your summons will die. You don't want this unit dying, so we're kind of already running into an issue here where we have one of our summons is not really that great at being a summon. Now, of course, the Slither Hatchling is really good, but you have to build him in a city. You can't just summon him, which is actually kind of a large drawback. But the Slither Hatchling is actually pretty good. Wyvern Hatchling is firmly okay, I guess, but I'd just rather have a Zealot any day of the week. Most summons are going to be worse than a Zealot, but as we can see from the Summon Irregulars, Summon Irregulars can also summon down a racial tier 1 unit. So there's two different tomes that can give much better summons than Tome of Evolution. This brings us to Rapid Evolution Enchantment, which of course all units that evolve get enchanted. They get 20% more experience, and then if they're tier 1 or 2, they get slip away. What's the problem with this? This doesn't really scale because it only affects our tier 1 units, and tier 1 and tier 2 units, and then it doesn't give those tier 3 units slip away at all. Now, it can affect your dragons, I guess, once we get into Tome of Dragons, but it only gives experience from combat. That a lot of ways to level up dragons isn't really combat, because combat on the map can run out. A lot of ways to level up dragons right now involves some other stuff. So realistically, this just doesn't scale that well. It can be okay at evolving your units, but it's just the tome never really worked, and yeah. Draconic Vitality is a minor race transformation that used to be much better and now isn't. Somebody in the comments commented that used to get 2 HP per unit rank, now you get 10 by default, whereas Draconic Vitality is still giving only 3 per unit rank. That means when the average unit health was like 60, 70, 80, this was giving 3 per rank, which could be impactful. Now the average unit health is like 100 plus, and it's still only giving 3 per unit rank. This means a max rank unit is what, 15 HP? It's not really that big a deal. Now it's coming out of a tier 1 tome, sure, so it's not going to do that much, but it's still just not really doing that much. As compared to Tome of the Horde, once again with the Spawnkin, which scales great and does a lot of damage, Draconic Vitality doesn't. So the Tome of Evolution, just its premier unit is a Slither Hatchling, and just I think in my last video when I went over this, I kind of said it was like bad, but the more I thought about it and the more I looked at it, the more I realized it's not bad, it's really bad. It doesn't scale. It doesn't really help us early game. The most we can do is get some Slither Hatchlings and then evolve them to maybe try to tempo play someone down, but there's a couple problems with that. If we're trying to tempo play someone out of the game, then we'd rather use a better tome to do that. And B, this means we're going to be trying to power level our slithers with our hero, which might be hard to do because they might die, but B, we're stealing a lot of experience from our hero, and it's probably better to have your heroes at a high level than to have your slithers at a high level. Okay, this moves us to Tome of Revelry. Tome of Revelry is one of the better tomes in the game, and it's in a lot of ways kind of confusing why. It's always been one of the better tomes in the game. It's always been one of the generically good tomes. But in a lot of ways, it can be confusing why it's so good. Because on paper, it has blood fury weapons, which is certainly good. But there's a lot of things in the game that can give damage. So let's go over Tome of Revelry. First off, its building is Carnival of Flesh. This is a farm that gives you food and draft. In the recurring theme of Chaos Tomes not really doing anything good for their buildings, we have another building that's firmly okay, I guess. So if we stack a lot of farms, which we wouldn't want to do, we would get a lot of food and a lot of draft. Unfortunately, we'd need to stack like 3 farms around our Tome of Revelry for this building to match a lot of other tier 1 tomes and their usefulness. So now we need 4 farms in a city, all stacked perfectly around each other, for a Carnival of Flesh to be as useful as some other buildings. It's just really not that good. The main and most powerful aspect of this tome is just a generic +2 damage buff to all our melee units. That's pretty good. Then if any of our units get a kill an enemy, they get more morale and then +1 strengthened. So Tome of Revelry is just really good at doing damage. You do more damage. Because you exist, you get more damage, which is pretty good. The second most powerful aspect of this tome is Reveler's Heart. Your entire race just generates 50% more morale from all sources. Now, I did mention this earlier in when I went over the form traits. Generally, if a battle is even, you're losing as much morale as you're gaining. This means Reveler's Heart will, unless you're hard losing a battle, give you more morale over the course of a battle, which eventually will translate into more crit. Even if you are losing and gaining units at the exact same time, they're killing a unit, you're killing a unit, they're killing a unit, you're killing a unit, eventually you will hit high morale just in that situation because you're generating more morale than you're losing. Additionally, because it affects all sources, this allows you to reach high morale and then keep that high morale much more consistently. So Reveler's Heart is really good, and Blood Fury Weapons is really good. Revels of Blood is a siege project that you probably should not research ever. It doesn't give you more siege progress, and you get 10 morale at the start of the battle, and the enemy loses 10 morale. It exists. You could misclick it, I guess. Revels of Carnage is another pretty good thing from this tome. Debatable. Some people don't like it or think it's that good. I think it's actually pretty decent. So units in target-friendly army get 30% experience from combat for 3 turns. This is really useful, actually. You put this on your hero stack as you're leveling in the early game, and you get them much higher levels. That kind of does scale. A lot of people don't really think about that. If your heroes are higher level, Of course, remember, you can reanimate heroes, you can revive heroes, respawn them, etc., etc., and your Lord, of course, always revives. Having your Lord and your heroes at higher levels just generally helps you throughout the entire game, period. Additionally, this allows you to hit a level 16 power spike, maybe a turn or two earlier compared to other players, and that level 16 power spike is really, 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 really powerful. So, Tome of Revelry does scale, actually, with Blood Fury weapons, good scaling, Reveler's Heart, good scaling, Revels of Carnage, good scaling. This is a pretty good scaling tome with 3 different options that are pretty good. Carnival of Flesh does exist, and you might even build it one day if you have nothing better to do. Revels of Blood, you might accidentally research. That brings us to Scald. Now, Scald, despite looking like it, is not actually a racial unit. It's actually, what is it? It's a fiend. Yeah, it's an infernal fiend. It's not a racial unit. Maybe it should be a racial unit. That would probably help it scale more. I think if it was a racial unit, that would actually be pretty good, especially considering, I think they nerfed it a while back, and since then it's been firmly, not bad, but not exactly good. So we have a tier 3 support unit, which is ideal. Tier 3 is very, very good, obviously, because that's kind of your exact hit point. Tier 3 generally will never stop being good, but, you know, support units sometimes do stop being good, but here we have a tier 3 support unit, so we will scale. I'm going to stop saying tier 3 and support unit right now. Non-racial does hurt it, but it does have some decent effects here. Its attack is 18 fire damage and a 40% chance to inflict insanity. Insanity is an extremely strong debuff, and it's not consistent, which is going to be another problem going forward with Chaos Tomes. It's not consistent, but when it does hit an enemy, it's pretty strong. Fortunately, you will be spending most of your turns casting Song of Carnage or Song of Revelry. Now, these only hit enemies adjacent to it, which makes it really hard to use consistently and makes it a bit difficult to continue to scale with into the late game, but its effects are pretty decent. We get Rally, which gives us more morale generation per turn, which of course with this tome will hit into high morale very, very quickly, and 2 regeneration. So all friendly units around it will get a little bit of healing and then a little bit of morale. The other one is we get 2 strengthened and 2 fortune to all adjacent units, giving our friends a lot of damage and then even more damage through having more crit. So these 2 songs are pretty strong, and well, they're pretty strong. Nothing more to say than that. They can kind of run into issues scaling just because you have to hit adjacent, and it's kind of awkward to like shove your support unit right up into the front line, and it's really awkward to have everyone you want to buff adjacent to you, especially when you can't use it in an enemy zone of control. So it does have some issues scaling, but the Scald is pretty good. I would say just a good scaling tome, good strong pick, nothing wrong here. Tome of Mayhem seems to be kind of the opposite in a lot of ways. You know, I don't know why I have so many of these tomes put. I keep going back to my tier list, and I keep thinking so many of these tomes I do not have in their proper place. So Tome of Mayhem is also a tome. We do actually get a tier 3 summon out of a tier 2 tome, which should happen the majority of the time, but sometimes it doesn't, which is kind of annoying. So summon Gremlin. Oh boy, let's just go look at him right now. Oh no, wait, it's a tier 2 unit. Oh wait, no, I totally forgot about that. This is the other. This is the bad tome. Summon Gremlin. We're summoning a tier 2 unit out of a tier 2 tome, which isn't good. Most tomes summon tier 3 units. Literally what I said. This is actually the bad tome. It's bad. It's a tier 2 unit that we're summoning out of a tier 2 tome. We don't really want it. It's a skirmisher unit, which is okay, but it's non-racial. It's not really that strong, etc., etc. Its most important aspect is displacement. Whenever it takes damage, it teleports to a random location within 2 hexes. Works once per turn. This makes it kind of hard to hit in melee because it can just randomly teleport away from you. Unfortunately, it can randomly teleport towards an enemy and then die. Now, displacement does, of course, have a secondary effect, where if you're trying to triple shot it with a ranged attack and it teleports out of range after the first hit, the next 2 hits are just totally wasted. so it can actually be kind of annoying to hit and kill with ranged units. Its two abilities here are actually decent enough. We have a somewhat fire damaging melee attack that hits decent. Behind you, flips an enemy 180 degrees, cancels their defense mode, and cancels their charge resistance. This allows you to flip an enemy around and then flank them for really high damage, even if they were guarding. Behind you is probably the most important aspect of the gremlin, and it's pretty powerful. Unfortunately, the unit is still tier 2, and it's fine, I guess, but it's just like, you would rather have a tier 3 summon out of a tier 2 tome, not a tier 2 one, especially when tier 2 units are going to start hitting their cap of usability. As we start getting 18 units that we can actually fight in 18v18 battle with 3 stacks, the gremlin can start being less and less useful when you want to start replacing units with tier 3 units that just are higher tier and therefore are stronger. Yeah, we have no building at all, just none, because why not? We have Mark of Misfortune, which fortunately does hit all ranged units. A lot of these enchantments will only hit like bowmen, or they'll only hit mages, and I don't like that, because it should either affect all melee or all range or all units entirely. So this one is at least good for that. The downside is this effect here is really not that amazing. Enchanted units are afflicted with Misfortune. Misfortune gives enemies a fumble chance, and then whenever they fumble, they take 8 physical damage, and then it stacks up to 3 times. So hypothetically, this can be pretty good. The downside is I think this still gets resisted by defense, so the damage is not nearly as good as you possibly think. If it ignored defense, it might be too good, but without ignoring defense, it doesn't really deal that much damage to begin with. The fumble chance is okay, because they do half damage, and that can be strong, but we're hitting an enemy with a ranged unit. We're probably not going to get them to 3 Misfortune, but even if we do make them graze, we're still taking damage, we're just taking half damage. It's fine, and if it was in a better tome, it might maybe work, but it's just not a winning gameplay, in my opinion, to try to debuff enemies to make them do less damage, especially in a tome that has no healing or anything like that. So we need to kill our enemies, but instead we're just kind of joking with them. But it could hypothetically work, I don't know. This is Curse of Misfortune. Enemies in a 2 hex radius suffer 2 Misfortune. It's a decent enough spell that can actually screw with enemies. Unfortunately, the reality of the situation is afflicting them with 2 Misfortune means enemies deal 15% less damage in a 2 hex radius. When you phrase it like that, it's not really that amazing. Enemies in a 2 hex radius deal 15% less damage. Okay. I mean, yay. You'd much rather buff yourself and kill enemies than slightly debuff enemies. Okay. Incite Revolution is probably the other decent aspect of this tome that can scale pretty decently through, I'm going to call it shenanigans. Target enemy city, loses a border province and a population, then you spawn a brigand camp on that province, or a pirate camp if it's in the ocean. Is this strong? Yes. So kind of going into what I was talking about Calamity in one of my previous videos, the thing about Incite Revolution is you don't use this aggressively and just give an enemy a camp to farm. What you do is you use this on a free city or an enemy player or AI, an enemy empire that you kind of have control over their city, or at least you're nearby. And what you do is you kill one of their population, which can be frustrating, and then you spawn that brigand camp and farm it yourself. Then by farming it yourself, you get the item from the camp, which should count as a infestation. I believe this does count as an infestation, which then gives you an item for free, and then gives you XP. As the game goes on, XP on the map will get more and more limited as people clear stuff out. And this is a way to fight another player while also not falling behind too far in experience, because you're generating more experience by just farming these camps, and then also you get items and the rewards from clearing an infestation. This can also be combined with some other shenanigans to kind of generate a lot of resources. Incite Revolution can be a bit more complicated to use, but once you do understand it, it's actually not bad. It's actually kind of powerful. So Confusion, it's a siege project. Now this does actually give fortification damage, so good. At the start of the battle, enemy units are displaced by 4 hexes and gain 1 stack of misfortune. It's there to get fortification damage, I guess. It's not useless. It just, like, this is like the haha tome where it's like, haha, didn't that suck to get misfortune? But it doesn't win. It's just like, haha, oh man, I really got you with that one. Like, okay. And that's kind of how I'm going to describe the whole tome. It's like from like the okay tome where it's like, oh man, that was what a minor inconvenience you did to me. Oh, this slightly impacted my plans. You didn't kill any of my people, but ooh, you gave me a moderate amount of annoyance. Oh, that sucked. Okay. This brings us to Tome of the Cleansing Flame, which is, in my opinion, one of the most broken tomes in the game, and let's talk about why. So first off, we have the Pyre Shrine, which is, again, a forester, which is wonderful. But we do get 15 gold, which is at least decent. But the most important thing is, every unit produced by this city gets Faithful. Faithful procs a lot of buffs, from some later tomes potentially, but also just reduces the unit upkeep. This is a pretty decent building. It gives draft per adjacent forester, but you're probably not gonna have a lot of those. But it gives every unit produced in this city Faithful, which is just pretty strong because it applies the Faithful buff. Once again, you might not believe this, to all the units. To units that maybe shouldn't be Faithful can be getting Faithful, reducing their upkeep or synergizing a lot. And then, of course, gives you the Cleansing Flame Herald just for unlocking the tome. In all your battles for the entire rest of the game, all burning ground becomes Cleansing Flame. Then all enemies you killed spawn Cleansing Flame. What is Cleansing Flame? Units passing through or ending their turn on this hex, if they are Faithful or Zealous, they lose a negative status effect. So they get moderately cleansed. All non-zealous or non-faithful units get burning as if it was regular flame. Then all enemies that are condemned, in addition to burning, lose positive status effects. So between Pyre Shrine making all your people faithful that you build, and Cleansing Flame Herald just generally buffing your army now to... They're very difficult to light on fire because all flame is now Cleansing Flame, which... Do you notice the synergy here? And you're getting a lot of this for not really much investment. So that brings us to, of course, the synergy with the Tome of Pyromancy. We have Flame Blessed Champions. This makes all our melee other than Shock, Polearm, Shield, Fighter, Skirmisher, non-skirmisher. So this makes all our melee other than skirmishers have a 60% chance of lighting enemies on fire. Then, if they have 5 stacks of burning, you create a cleansing flame under the enemy. So not only does this give all your melee a high chance of just stacking dots up on tankier enemies, but if they are stacked up with dots completely, you create a flame under them, which then, if they are condemned, will start ripping away their buffs. Additionally, and probably most importantly, this allows melee units to proc their own searing blades by lighting enemies on fire, then giving them 20% more damage against them. So, Tome of Cleansing Flame synergizes highly with Pyromancy, and just generally all ready for doing nothing special. You are way immune to fire damage. I shouldn't say immune. You're much more highly resistant to fire damage, and you can activate that 20% more damage from Tome of Pyromancy way easier. Pure Flame Staves is a buff to support units and battle mage units that isn't really actually that bad either. This gives your support units and your battle mages a 60% chance of inflicting condemned, and then automatically lights the ground under them on fire for 3 turns, even if you miss, even if you can't resist it, it just lights them on fire. This allows your support units to start irritating enemies really hard, because you can start lighting the ground on fire. This makes melee v melee engagements, you're just generally going to have a lot more fire for either your units to get cleansed or enemy units to get purged. or enemy units to start stacking up damage. Pure Flame Staves, it's just generally like a good enchantment. Consecrating Firestorm is also another generally good spell here. Now it's a world map spell that any enemy province that doesn't contain an ancient wonder has its province improvement raised. Now it needs to be non-friendly. That's kind of one thing, so you can't use it defensively. So it does have one downside, but enemy units in that province suffer 20 spirit damage, then get condemned for 3 world map turns, which is unusual. Most of these spells only affect enemies for 1 turn, but they get condemned, which of course reduces their status resist by default, and then also makes them get purged on Cleansing Flames. Then on the first turn of the battle, you create Cleansing Flames on a lot of random hexes. Now of course after 3 turns they will go away, but it makes the start of the battle much more frustrating for enemies to manage. So we got a pretty good buff for our melee here, a decent buff for supports and battle mages if you are still using them. This does help them a lot. Consecrating Firestorm is pretty strong as well. And then this brings us to Zealous Ignition, which is one of the okayest spells. It's not bad. So a target friendly unit gets Zeal until the end of the battlefield. If it already had Zeal, it gets 2 strengthened. So this is actually useful as a way to give your heroes Zeal, or if they already were Zealed, to give them 2 strengthened. Then all enemy units within a 2 hex radius get condemned. Now of course Zeal gives you spirit damage, and spirit damage is doubled against condemned enemies. So this is pretty useful again at now debuffing enemies with reduced status resistance, or just making them take a lot more damage, or just generally getting ways to purge off their buffs. Then all enemy units within a 2 hex radius, or I should say all provinces within a 2 hex radius, get lit on fire for 3 turns. So this spell's a bit complicated, but it can do a lot of different things. It can be one way if you've only gone into Cleansing Flame. This is a way to get your heroes Zeal so that they can generally activate the buffs of the Cleansing Flame Herald a bit more. If your heroes already had Zeal, this is a way to get them strengthened. If you're just using on a regular unit, this is a way to light everyone on fire to do a lot of damage over time. Or if you just need to deal more damage to enemies, it condemns them, which reduces their status resist, so you can dot them up more, or alternatively, just, you know, do more spirit damage off Zeal. So Zealous Ignition, it does cost a lot, 45-30 here. If this could just stay. So it does cost a lot and maybe might not be useful in the hyper late game, but it is a pretty good spell to have under your belt. Now this brings us to the Pyre Templar. The Pyre Templar is broken. I don't know a better way to put this. He's actually just straight overpowered. Since the last time I've talked about him, I've just kind of come to the conclusion that the Pyre Templar is just overpowered and kind of just needs to be nerfed at this point. The Pyre Templar does a bizarrely high amount of damage. Even once we ignore the Zeal, he's still at 14 damage, and the vast majority of that in fire. You don't need to get him Zeal. He's always Zealous, which just makes him pretty strong. He does a cleave in front of him on all his attacks, even on his retaliation attacks, which he's technically not supposed to be doing. He's not even supposed to be doing bonus damage on his cleave to begin with, but he is. Now, he's a polearm unit, so he does more damage against cavalry and large targets, which will be a lot of enemies. He has good base stats, 110, 5, and is a racial unit, so all those racial buffs, if you gave yourself resistance on your race, for example, he'll have 110 HP with 7 resistance, making him quite a durable character. And of course, as I did mention, he's a polearm unit, so he's got that first strike and charge resistance, kind of making him difficult to deal with. He cannot be burned at all, giving him something of a resistance. And then he has 6 base fire resist, which I guess you could argue because he's a Pyre Templar, he should have it. But generally resistances don't just come for free. You get some sort of downside for them, but he just gets them for free. His special ability here, Pyrocloak, makes all adjacent land on fire and does 20 fire damage. Then he enters defense mode, making it very useful aggressively because you can just enter defense mode. It does a decent amount of damage, but not amazing at 20. It lights enemies on fire, and of course creates that cleansing flame, which of course, if they're condemned, will purge off their buffs. Or if you are zealous, which you are by default, you will then of course dispel debuffs off you. This unit is the more I play with and against Pyro Templars, the more I'm convinced this unit is just insane and is probably overall the best unit in the game. A tier 4 racial unit comes in with very good stats. There's no tier 3 racial unit that could possibly fight against this unit. And yeah, it kind of, you can see right here in the Warbreed, the Warbreed is 10 more HP, and the Warbreed was generally considered one of the best units in the game. It is only 10 more HP to lose a defense and to lose 2 resistance, and it has no fire resist. This makes a Pyro Templar one of the tankiest units in the entire game for some reason, while also doing really good damage. And then because it has such synergy with everything, it's just a really, really, really tanky spearman. It's really strong. So yeah, when you combine the Cleansing Flame Tome with the Pyro Templar, we just end up at a really bizarrely good tome that has like no downsides and is just outrageously good. Now of course we get the Temple of the Pyre, which doesn't give your city any actual benefits. You don't get any like gold or knowledge or anything like that. A lot of defensive buildings will give you something, this one doesn't. You get 10 fortification health, and then your city ignores the income and stability penalties from being under siege. So this building is really good if an area is going to be under siege, but has a lot of fortification health to resist it, because you'll generally just be able to exist under siege and not really care that much. Then any battle in that domain, the entire city's domain, any battle that starts, all enemy units start the battle condemned, which as we've shown is kind of a useful debuff to have on enemies. So it's not like that amazing, but it's just really useful at making it hard for enemies to push into you. Then of course the Pyro Templar is just silly strong. The Pyre Shrine can reduce all units upkeep and give them a pretty good buff. It's just generally way too good of a tome, and I really wish they would tone it down. There's something wrong with this tome. This brings us to another tier 3 tome, in which you might see a very large power disparity coming out here. This is a tier 3 tome, and Tome of Dragons is also a tier 3 tome. Now what does Tome of the Dragons do? The building is a research post that gives knowledge, making it firmly okay. Tier 3 is a bit late to only be doing that little bit. It gives draft per adjacent farm, which can be okay. If you only hit 2 farms, it's 10 draft, which is fine, I guess. Then you can produce any wyvern units in the city. Unfortunately, building tier 3 units at tier 3 and they don't get any racial buffs can be a bit questionable. There's the upside that if you go Mystic Summoners, I guess you could try to buff these wyvern units. The devs should probably look at non-racial units. It shouldn't be. All non-racial units are generally bad. Unless you go Mystic Summoners, then they're good. That's kind of not the greatest balance, but at its baseline, Wyvernary doesn't really help you, nor will you really ever use the Wyverns built from it anyway. So then it's just a generic research post with 10 knowledge, sometimes some draft. Not amazing, and tier 3, with the tier 3 production cost for it, it's not really that great. Its first effect here only affects battle mages, which are generally the worst unit types in the game. It doesn't even affect supports or anything like that. It's a firebomb, so surely it could affect more. Firebomb is a magic attack that is not really that good. It does 10 physical, 10 fire damage to an enemy. It doesn't count as a base attack, so it doesn't get buffed by any of those effects that you might have gotten that only affect base attacks. Target enemy unit takes 10 damage, half of it physical, which is weird because it's a magical attack, so you'd think it would be all magical, but whatever. With a 90% chance to be burning and a 90% chance to be bleeding. Then all adjacent units also suffer that and 50% of the damage. When they changed all the AoE spells from a 2-turn cooldown to a 1-turn cooldown, they didn't affect Firebomb. So Firebomb isn't really that useful. doesn't really scale that amazingly. I'll say it like that. You generally aren't using battle mages anyway, and it's just not really that good. I guess you could argue if you had a tier 3 battle mage, it could be something that they could sit in the back and use. It does have 6 range, but it uses all 3 action points. You can't move after using it. I just generally find the battle mage support in this game to be really weak. The developers really did not, they just didn't give enough support to battle mages, and this is another example of that. Purifying Flame is, of course, in Tome of Dragons. I would say Purifying Flame is probably the second best aspect of Tome of Dragons. This is an AoE cleanse that heals for 25 hit points. Now, the downside is you're using 35 of your combat casting points and 80 mana, and that's pretty rough of a sell here. So if we look at, for example, Tome of Alchemy, this is also a 1 hex dispel, but it doesn't heal, but it costs a lot less mana at 10 and a lot less combat casting at 15. You can often find yourself actually preferring anti-magic tincture because it's not using so much of your mana and combat casting. But, you know, if you do need a cleanse, it is a 25 heal and it is a complete dispel. Honestly, it could probably be buffed a little bit. That's kind of the theme, a lot of these tomes that are bad. They could probably be buffed a little bit. At some point, the developers should probably take the time to go back through all these tomes that aren't really that good and just kind of tone them up a little bit. Just do like a little bit. Just help them out a little bit, because it's not like Tome of the Dragons is bad from a conceptual level. It's that Tome of Dragons is bad from a practical level, in that once you actually use the tome, practically, it's just not really that good. Draconian Transformation is the best aspect of the tome because it, with no debuffs, makes your entire race dragons, which does, of course, affect your heroes. Dragons gives you Draconic Rage. When you're When your hit points are 60% or lower, you deal 30% more damage. That's just a pretty good buff. Now, this is a major race transformation, so you can only do one of them, but it's one of the few major race transformations with no downside. Then you get natural regeneration, so at the end of your turn, you heal 10% of your health. Natural regeneration feels really good on paper, but the reality of the situation is I found it's not really that amazing. It can heal a good amount of HP, like 15, which is decent, and it can make you survive AoEs a lot better. And it can also kind of keep your units topped off throughout a fight. But it doesn't help you at the beginning of your turn, it only helps you at the end of your turn, which you could argue could help you mitigate the effects of maybe retaliation attacks and things like that. But I think Draconian Transformation is fine, but I think natural regeneration kind of gets a bit overvalued because people just generally, it doesn't matter what game you play, in every game people just generally they look at healing and they go, oh man, with this healing I can take 0 damage in a fight and tank through it all. But a majority of the times a little bit of healing isn't gonna allow you to tank through a fight. You would need a lot of healing to tank through a fight, and anyone that dies will generally stay dead. So, you know, Dragon Attack, and I have gone through this tome before, so I'm kind of speed running through it. Dragon Attack is okay. Units defending the city take 26 fire damage and have a 90% chance of burning. It's not that amazing, especially when we compare this to everyone's favorite tome. You know exactly what we're going to. Tome of Alchemy. Fumigation, they only take 16 blight damage, but they automatically get 2 poisoned instead of a chance at 1 burning. Fumigation will, I'm going to be real with you, arguably will be better than the tier 3 tome. That's right. Dragon Attack, especially because it doesn't actually give you any siege progress, will arguably be weaker than the tier 1 Fumigation. So think about that in your head. This brings us to Young Dragon, which of course has to be built in a city, but is arguably the better part of this tome. So let's just look at a dragon, and we'll look at it generally. Let's look at, I don't know, golden dragon. So I did mention this earlier when I went through the nature tomes. I'm gonna try to not spend too much time here again, or maybe we will. It's a fighter unit at tier 3, non-racial, so it doesn't get buffs, but it does have 10 more health over the racial tier 3 units. Not enough to compensate for being non-racial, but at least they tried something. We do have high maintenance because I don't know why. This unit doesn't really seem like a high maintenance kind of unit, but okay. All these dragons will of course have intimidating aura, which means that at the end of their turn, all adjacent enemies have a 90% chance to lose 5 morale. They get a damage modifier based on what type they are. So frost dragons do frost damage, obsidian dragons do lightning damage, and golden dragons do spirit damage. It goes on like that. You might be shocked, but fire dragons do fire damage. It does a lot of that damage type. So we're looking at 17, which is above average. So young fire dragons will actually do a lot of fire damage on the basic attack. It does get a little bit of resistance into whatever they are. So golden dragon will get 4 spirit resist and -2 blight. Overall, you're getting 2 more resistance and you're losing. This does give you a downside though, but on the right dragon, for example, a golden dragon, that spirit resist could be very, very, very impactful depending on who you're fighting. You get the Draconic Rage, which of course all dragons get. Your special ability is Tail Swipe. Up to 3 enemies adjacent around you lose defense mode and lose a retaliation attack. So this is pretty good for setting up your other melee units to getting good hits on enemies. They get True Sight for some reason. I don't know. Overall, as a tier 3 unit, they're not the worst tier 3 unit I've ever seen in my life, but being non-racial is starting to really hurt them. Their main aspect is they evolve into an actual dragon. Now, these actual dragons can be pretty impactful. So if we go here and we look into dragons, and once again, I did go through this, so I'm going to try to not spend that much time on it. These actual dragons, these tier 5 ones that they could hypothetically evolve into, can be pretty strong. Coming in with pretty high stats, they are unfortunately counted as a mythic unit, so they do not get buffed by anything at all. The only things they'll get buffed by are things that directly buff dragons, which there are a couple in the game, but overall not really that many. All dragons get a very high damage repeating attack that can apply debuff. They get a decent damage tail swipe that's pure physical and generally won't deal nearly as much damage as you're hoping. And then of course they get their breath attack. Depending on which dragon, so you can see golden dragon will deal less damage but then heal friendly allies. Fire dragon, and I think all the other dragons for the most part, will then deal 28 damage and have a high chance of getting a pretty good debuff. So for example, the frost dragon has a 60% chance of freezing any enemy it hits with its breath attack. 28 magical damage, especially on a mythic unit, means it's probably not going to be dealing that much damage anymore, but these debuffs can be pretty decent. Yeah, this one has a 60% chance to stun enemies, and then a chance to electrify as well. So, unfortunately, Lightning Breath is a 5-hit. So each of the dragons have different quirks on them. I'm not going to try to go through them. Each of the dragons, and of course, has, you can see it's just generally very high damage on their basic attack. And then, Draconic Rage, Fearless, Control Loss Immunity, Demolisher, High Maintenance, which is really rough for a tier 5 unit. Juggernaut, they'll always have some sort of aura, so enemies hitting your dragons will take damage and then have a high chance of having some negative effect applied to them. So for example, the Frost Dragon has the Frost Aura, which is a chance to slow enemies and inflicts good frost damage. Overall, especially if you built for it, dragons are strong. The tier 5 dragons can be pretty strong. Obviously, you might not believe that, but yeah, they're pretty strong units, and if you can get a lot of them, you could get a lot of pretty strong units. And if you buff them with nature tomes, they can be pretty good. Nature tomes can buff them, and some astral tomes can buff magic affinity units. Mystic summoners can also buff them. So there's different ways to buff dragons. Overall though, if you're not playing for a very specific look into dragons, the only thing you're looking out of this tome is Draconian Transformation. Now, some people do like Draconian Transformation and think it's pretty strong. I think it's firmly okay. So I think Tome of Dragons is firmly okay as a tome. It's not blowing my mind, but between Purifying Flame and Draconian Transformation, it can be okay. But we're looking at a tier 3 tome that really only has 2 reasons to pick it if you're not going with the dragons. Additionally, if you are going with full dragons, then you're not using Draconian Transformation, which, okay, I guess. Tome of the Dreadnought is a interesting tome because here's the problem with Tome of the Dreadnought. If you're not going with a construct build, for example, if you're going with the chaos route, then Tome of the Dreadnought is not going to be very good, obviously. This is not a generically good tome. It's a good tome, but it's a good tome because it synergizes specifically with constructs and only constructs. So if you're not going constructs, just don't even look at this tome. If you are going constructs, it's got a lot of positives for it. Now let's look through its spells here. Sorry. My mouth gets dry as I talk for hours on end, huh? So I got Pinning Barrage. Now I did go over this, I think, a few days ago, so I'll try to speed run it again. Pinning Barrage. All enemies in a 2x radius suffer 20 physical damage, become marked, and have a 60% chance of being immobilized. The 20 physical damage by this point is probably not dealing that much. We're probably looking at 10, 12, 13 damage, somewhere around there. The mark can be really applicable if you're playing a Reaver build, but more importantly is that 60% chance of immobilizing enemies. This could be a seriously, I mean, it immobilizes. It can seriously immobilize the enemy army and really stop them from taking their turn in a fair way. The 60% chance to immobilize, though, isn't really high chance. The general idea is you just have a high chance of immobilizing them overall, and immobilizing enough units to screw at the enemy's turns and generally make it really hard on them. Overall, I'd rate it a pretty decent spell. This could last until the late game. Pretty decent. Warding Metals only affects shields and construct units, which will get increasingly hard to do over time. Warded only affects magic attacks, so it gives you 3 resistance against magic attacks. Now, while there are some effects, and I did talk about this, I do count as magic. Certainly I do believe dragons, if I look right here, if I look into the fire dragon, the fire breath, yeah, this one does count as a magic attack. So there are some things in the game that you can get resistance to, but I would say overall there's not as many magical defined attacks as you really think. So, and again, this only affects constructs and shielded units, which very likely, if you're going into chaos, they won't affect you anyway. So much like Tome of Dragons, this tome, you need to be building into it, and a generic chaos build isn't really going to be affected by this tome much or at all. Destabilized Mana Core really does significantly less damage than you're thinking. So it marks all enemies in a 2-hex radius, which can synergize well if you're doing Reavers. And then after 1 turn, so if the enemy takes their turn and ends within this, they then take 24 physical damage and 24 lightning damage, which hits way less hard than you'd think. You're thinking big 50 damage Giga Nuke, and the reality is you hit for like 23 damage of a unit that has like 150 HP. This is not the Giga Nuke you think it is, and really, every time I've seen Destabilized Mana Core used, and every time I've seen it hit, my thoughts have been, boy, that was really, really underwhelming. The 60% chance of disrupting enemies turns off their unit enchantments, which can seriously screw them over, but I haven't really seen that either be that impactful. Now, Destabilized Mana Core is, like, Pinning Barrage is 80-35 cost. Destabilized Mana Core comes down at 30-25. So it seems the developers did acknowledge that Destabilized Mana Core needs to be much cheaper because it's just simply not as good. The downside is it's still taking your entire turn of casting, and it's still taking 25 combat mana. If you don't have ways to generate infinite combat mana, that can still add up a lot for a spell that might not do that much. Tuning Kits, if you're going constructs, is good. If you're not, well, any support unit gets the overcharged ability. You can heal a friendly construct for 20 and then give it overcharged. Overcharged gives it 50% more damage. I'm not sure why they say 50, and they've never fixed it. but then it also has a 30% chance of stunning itself for 2 turns when it attacks, which sucks. I'm not sure why they did that. As with the last time I overviewed this tome, that really sucks, and actually that should probably be removed, because that's really not cool to have such an RNG effect chance of just screwing yourself over that much. So, Tome of the Dreadnought, really can only be used with constructs. We've got Construct Great Bombard, which, it's a siege project. At least it does a lot of fortification damage here. And then at the start of the battle, you get a Great Bombard. It's a pretty decent unit. It does damage. It sunders defense. It's fine. It's not bad. It's not good. It's fine. Does this not even ignore armor? Oh, I guess not. This brings us to the Ironclad, which for reasons I mentioned in my other video is really not that good. Now, let's look at the... I don't know, let's just look at it so you guys can see the Ironclad. It counts as a mythic unit, so it's really hard to buff. It does count as a construct, so you can use the buff from the tome itself on it. Now, it is decently tanky, coming at 100 HP, 5-3 resistances. It is reinforced, so shooting with ranged attacks won't do that much unless you have physical damage. Now, this has to be built in a city, which actually can be good a lot of times, because that means you're not using a world casting points, but it has high maintenance, so it's very expensive. While this damage might look very good, bombarding 3 times to deal a gajillion damage, or directly shooting an enemy for 40 damage, while the damage does look good on paper, the problem with this unit is because it's mythic. A lot of times this unit will only deal about the same damage a regular archer would have anyway, and because barrage, each time it shoots, it can change where it's shooting. It has a chance to do that. Oftentimes you will not hit your target with all 3 barrages, and a lot of times I've even hit my allies, which when I load a shrapnel shot makes me bleed. So the idea is you apply 5 bleeds to an enemy, but I've had it hit an enemy, then reposition over my front line, and then make my front line bleed, which then I end my turn and I take a huge amount of damage from my own unit. It can't scale very good because it's a mythic unit, so it's not going to pick up many more enchantments, if any. It can pick up construct enchantments, that's about it. It's a siege breaker, so it contributes to fortification damage, and that can be okay. Other than that, it's just really underwhelming. Possibly one of the most underwhelming units in the game. I promise you, every time you use Ironclad, you're going to think to yourself, wow, that was a unit, and I built it. And that's about all you're going to think about it. It's just not very good. I just don't think Ironclad is good. Now, War Foundry is possibly the biggest impact of the tome. This gives you a unique province that gives you 20 draft, 5 more draft per courier mine, which can stack up pretty hard to be a lot of draft out of your city. And then all construct units produced by that city get +2 rank when you produce them. So this tome, Tome of the Dreadnought, synergizes very well with higher tier Materium tomes to get those higher tier Materium tier 5 mythic units constructed at +1 rank. War Foundry is really good if you're going constructs. Tome of the Dreadnought's not really good if you're not going constructs. Overall, I'd say it's a pretty good tome in its overall impact if you're building for it, but you do need to build for it. And if we're talking about the Chaos Affinity here, well, yeah. Tome of Devastation has been power creeped, definitely, but I would say is still really good. Why is that? Because, of course, the Warbreed. The Warbreed is a unit that you get from this tome, and although it has been totally power creeped by the Pyro Templar, is still a pretty strong unit in its own right. We have a tier 4 racial unit. I assure you this is a racial unit. Yes. This giant ogre, this is basically a genetically modified super racial unit. It's pretty strong for that because it picks up all your racial buffs. We have the typical tier 4 7 status resist, and it is a shock unit as well, so it picks up all shock unit buffs, which there will be a lot of them. So we have a pretty strong unit. The downside is, of course, Charge Strike by default does almost entirely, or I guess it does entirely physical damage, and even with a bunch of enchantments, will still be doing primarily physical damage, which will be heavily mitigated. Magical damage is better. This is not heavy Charge Strike, but just Charge Strike, so of course it will be countered by any sort of charge resistance, perhaps on the Pyro Templar. So this unit will hard lose to any Pyro Templar, period. But it does have its own positives. If you're not fighting Pyro Templar, it's quite frustrating to deal with. If you've given it flying by making it a demon or anything like that, it will reposition really hard and be quite difficult to deal with. Charge Strike, of course, is displace and replace. The target unit it hits is moved back. Typically it's moved back one tile, but it can get a bit screwy if it's in a formation or anything like that. And then you move on to the tile that you moved it off of. So this is really good at disrupting enemy units, getting into their formation, getting them away from other units, getting them out of the ability to do AoE buffs. It's just generally really good at screwing with the enemy formation. Power Cleave needs all 3 attacks, but does 33 damage, and it does count as a base attack, so it gets a lot of buffs that a lot of other attacks like this won't get. Every enemy unit in a 1 hex cone loses defense mode and loses their retaliation attack. Warbreeds can hit their allies with this, which can make it kind of annoying to use sometimes, but it just does a lot of damage and can set up your other allies to hit enemies who were previously in defense mode. It has Demolisher, so it can destroy fortified objects, natural regeneration for free, so it just slowly heals throughout a battle, and then Siege Breaker, so you can, well, siege quicker. It is a tier 4 unit with pretty good stats. It will generally overwhelm anyone who doesn't have their own tier 4 racial unit. So the only thing is more and more people are going to use tier 4 racial units. And as Pyro Templars get more and more common for everyone to use, it definitely hard loses to that. But if an enemy has a build that doesn't have a tier 4 racial unit, this will generally completely annihilate them. Yeah, it's just generally a pretty strong unit. Tier 4 racials used to be much more rare, and then that's definitely where the Warbreed shined. They're more common now, so I would call it okay, but it's still really good, and it is still tier 4 racial, which if you need one, well, here it is. The natural generation can also be frustrating to fight, as these units kind of just for free heal throughout a battle. So I would say overall it's just pretty good, that one. The other positive aspects of this tome, and it doesn't have a building. Again, we're at another Chaos Tome without a building, which I guess I need to mention. It's just frustrating that a lot of Chaos Tomes just don't get a building. We have a siege project to construct Devastator Spears. This does 8 fortification damage, so this is really good through blowing through a city and getting through even heavily fortified cities in a mere 2 turns. At the start of the battle, the attacker gains 2 Devastator Spheres. Devastator Spheres are a 60 HP summon that just try to sprint up to an enemy unit and blow up, and then does 30 damage. It's not really, to be honest, it's not really that amazing, nor is it really even that good, but it's mainly the 8 fortification damage that's quite good here to blow through enemy tanky cities in a few turns. So it's an okay siege project. As far as siege project goes, this is probably one of the better ones. We also have Monstrous Rebirth, which turns any tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 unit into a Warbreed with 60 health. Or I should say it heals 60 health. Now, of course, that Warbreed dies at the end of combat, so you can't use this to generate more Warbreeds in rapid succession, to kind of like take a bunch of battles and turn your army into Warbreeds for a tempo play. You can't do that. But this does mean that if you have any tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 units in your army, you can, like if they're at half HP, you can turn them into a Warbreed and then get them back into the battle really quickly. It's pretty good at that. Then, of course, we have Focus and Devastation. This only affects battle mages and supports, which is fine, I guess. Not really that amazing. It is a 60% chance of canceling defense mode and then Demolisher. Now, canceling the defense mode is not consistent, which sucks. So, it's not really that amazing as an enchantment. It gives them Demolisher, which most of your army will be if you have Warbreeds, and realistically, it's an enchantment you take because you researched it. That's about all it is. Okay. Flame Burst Weapons has the heavy synergy with Barbarians, which this tome seems very much made for Barbarians to replace the Barbarian Berserker with Warbreeds, which is kind of confusing, but It seems a lot of Chaos Tomes are meant to replace Barbarian units. For example, I went over the Scald. It just seems the Scald was meant to be a better version of the War Shaman, right? So Flame Burst Weapons gives you heavy synergy with Barbarians by giving that crit chance to proc the Barbarian on hit, or should say on crit damage. Now this enchantment is actually way better than you think. In addition to getting the 20% critical hit chance, whenever you kill an enemy unit, it explodes, dealing fire damage to all adjacent enemy units, not allies, only enemies. But importantly, they explode, meaning there's no body, meaning they can't revive it. Flame Burst Weapons is really good, actually, because it is a enchantment that you're already going to get. It then counters anyone who's trying to revive their army, be it undead or angels, or even things like an elemental build. So Flame Burst Weapons is just one of these enchantments that starts off being already pretty good, and then also soft counters a lot of different things. So Tome of Devastation is still, despite it being power creep pretty hard, is still a really good tome. We're countering certain builds pretty hard. We're getting a really good unit, a tier 4 racial unit. We're getting a really good siege project. We're getting a decent battle effect, I guess. Okay, Tome of Pandemonium is a tome that I really wish was a lot better. It's certainly not a bad tome, it's just a tome that I wish was a lot better. Let's talk about Tome of Pandemonium. So the general idea is that the tome focuses on debuffing enemies and not having a building. Because if any Chaos Tome had a useful building after, well, at all, ever. If any Chaos Tome had a useful building, I think the developers might have to remove it. Because apparently they just don't get any. The tome focuses on debuffs. Now let's look at its spells here. Inflicts a random negative status effects on all units in a 1 hex radius. This sucks. If it was a 2 hex radius, I could see it at least being somewhat useful. But you inflict a single negative status effect on all enemies in a 1 hex radius. A single negative status effect. 1 at random. It might not even be useful. It's not often that I'll say something is just simply really bad, but this is just really pathetic. Havoc magic affects only battle mages and only support units, so not even archers or anything like that. Nothing. Now it grants base magic attacks, so it has to be base magic, not even magical AoEs or anything like that, which is... I honestly, I don't know. Does this affect? No, I don't think it does, because they wouldn't count as base. Huh. So they get a 60% chance of inflicting a random negative status effect. This could be good, hypothetically, but, I mean, due to everything I just said, this is sure not really that good, is it? If it affected the magical AoEs, then that'd be better, but I don't think they're counted as base, obviously, so they don't really get infected, which is just a very curious design decision. Maybe they didn't want mages applying this in an AoE, but then what's the point of building battle mages? Even their good enchantments aren't good on them. Infectious Insanity is probably the best part of this tome, overall. Target unit is a 90% chance of being inflicted with Infectious Insanity. Now, if they don't, then they just get insane for 1 turn. This is a very costly spell, coming at 100 mana and 40 combat casting. If an enemy is infected with Infectious Insanity, if they don't resist it, then they get insane permanently for the entire rest of the battle, which is really diabolical. Then all their attacks have a 50% chance of inflicting Infectious Insanity on the enemies, or I should say the allies they hit as well. Infectious Insanity can quickly get out of control and can be very frustrating for enemies to deal with who don't have cleanse. The problem is, if they do resist it, they get inflicted with Insanity for 1 turn. The upside is, if they do resist it, you afflict them anyway. So there's always a 100% chance you at least inflict an enemy with Insanity for 1 turn. It's probably one of the strongest things. Well, I mean, it's definitely the strongest thing in this tome, but it's actually, ironically, probably one of the strongest spells you can get from tier 3 entirely. It's just generally really good. yeah. This brings us to Vessels of Chaos, which is not bad, but is far less useful in practical gameplay than you'd think. Now, this is a minor race transformation, so this affects your entire race. You get 10% more damage per negative status effect on an enemy, stacking up to 3 times. This is really, really good in theory. In reality, most enemies aren't going to have status effects until you hit them. And the other downside is the 2 ways this tome has to apply status effect debuffs to enemies. Or I shouldn't say status effect, the negative status effect wording. The 2 ways this tome has to give enemies debuffs kind of suck. Havoc Magic is not very good, and Mass Hysteria is outright terrible. So the 2 ways this tome has to give enemies debuffs don't really work. So you need to come up with another way to get a negative status effects onto enemies. The other downside is this is a minor race transformation that doesn't even affect your summon. Now, your summon here is probably one of the better summons, and yet is also kind of crap. Part of the problem with Tome of Pandemonium is that it now directly conflicts with Tome of Corruption, which does everything it does, but infinitely better in an unimaginable way. Mass Hysteria here is you give enemies 1 negative status effect in a 1 hex radius. Amazing, top tier, right? Except Tome of Corruption, for only 45 mana and 30 combat casting, all enemy units in a 1 hex radius lose all their buffs and then get a counter buff. So if they were strengthened, they get weakened. If they were fortunate, now they get misfortune. Boy, that's better. That's just a tiny bit better, and it's the same cost. And okay, and Tome of in fact, let me show you this. I went over it earlier, so I hope you just remember it. Summon Umbral Mistress is one of the most broken units in the entire game. Has 100 stats, or I should say 100 health and 5/5 on its defenses, and is a 4 range unit. If we look into here at Tome of Chaos, we can see that the Summon Chaos Eater has that same HP, 1 less defense, 1 less resistance, as a 3 range unit. It is squishier and has less range. It's also, I mean, while the Umbral Mistress is one of the best units in the entire game, it is definitely overpowered. Chaos Eater, if we look through it right here, is firmly also a unit that you can build. It comes in here with -4 Frost Resist, -4 Spirit Resist, which is really not that good. An Infernal Fiend gives it critical hit chance, which is okay, I guess. It only does 8 damage on hit in a random damage type. Now it is repeating, so that's okay, I guess. It is a 60% chance of inflicting a random negative status effect. It does count as a battle mage, so I guess we could enchant it, and does that stack? Do I then get a 60% chance and then another 60% chance of debuffing enemies? Maybe, I guess. I've never actually tried it, to be honest with you. Its main effect here is that it has Consume Chaos. All adjacent enemies lose all their debuffs and then take 12 elemental damage for each status effect removed. Then this attack here has Lifesteal on a 1-turn cooldown. Now, I have seen this effect do an absolute gobload of damage, and I have seen this not one-shot people, but absolutely do like amazingly high amounts of damage. The downside is it counts as a battle mage, so it's a bit hard to buff. It comes out of an absolutely joke of a tome, and there's just much better units coming out of much better tomes that this unit is competing with. Now, it does have Chaos Rebuke. Anyone who attacks it within 3 hexes has a 60% chance of getting a random status effect. On its whole, this unit isn't bad. I wouldn't call it amazing, but it's certainly not a bad unit. It's kind of a good unit. It gets a really bad class here. Really bad. Consume Chaos is definitely strong, but I don't know why we have a tier 4 unit that is only doing 8 damage by default. This company seems to really hate battle mages and really hopes that they never are relevant or do anything at all. And I'm just really not sure why. So all I can really say about Tome of Pandemonium, it just doesn't work. So that brings us to Tome of the Demon Gate. I had to edit out because I got hiccups for like 10 minutes. So Tome of the Demon Gate is of course the tome for demons and summoning demons and being a demon. It's bizarrely one of the better tomes throughout Chaos and really hasn't, maybe it's been power creeped a little bit, but it's still pretty strong. So by default, you get the building Demon Gate. It's a teleporter, so you get a teleporter that allows you to recruit various Infernal Fiend units. The most important part of, I would say, recruiting the Infernal Fiend units isn't really anything other than the Infernal Juggernaut. Now that does come out of a DLC, you can see that symbol right there. Infernal Juggernaut is a unit that I do believe you can recruit from the Demon Gate now. That is an animal. This does count as an animal that you can recruit at tier 4. This allows you to hypothetically do an animal, a chaos animal build, and actually be able to recruit consistently tier 4 animals. The Infernal Juggernaut is also not really a bad unit on its own either. Certainly if you've buffed it with all the various animal effects, this unit can be pretty strong. Being a tier 4 shock unit, getting buffed from there, and then having Infernal Stomp, which isn't really the most amazing, but it's just generally a good way to kind of spread burning and stuff to enemies. It's not really that amazing. We've got Vengeful Flames because it counts as an Infernal Fiend. The -4 Spirit Resist and the -4 Frost Resist certainly hurt this unit a lot, but a demon animal is interesting. And if you're trying to do a beast build, I think it's just worth noting that here's a tier 4 beast you can technically recruit right now. Bit specific though. Other than that, we have the most powerful aspect of this tome, which is Demonkin. Demonkin turns into an Infernal Fiend, which gives you the 2 Fire Resist and the -4 Frost and Spirit. Now this is really bad, the Frost and Spirit, but you get 15% more crit. Demon Barbarian seems to be their ideal and only way they want you to play. But then you get Flying, which is outrageously powerful, too powerful really, but it's an entire race transformation with Flying, which is crazy strong. Then you get Frenzy, where whenever you attack an enemy, you get Strengthened, giving you 10% more damage. So between the 15% crit, the Flying, and the Frenzy, that allows a major race transformed into demons to do a lot of damage throughout a battle and reposition and just be generally very, 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 very strong. So Demonkin is of course very powerful. Gremlin Ambushers is also, for a chaos spell, weirdly good. Now you have to use your world casting points, which can be very limited, but once you cast it on a city, you sustain the spell, and then any battle fought in the domain of that city summons a gremlin every single turn on your side. Then you can summon up to 5 gremlins, but that's a lot of gremlins, and that gives you a lot of, I mean, they're only tier 2 units, but that gives you a large action economy advantage, and that certainly just gives you a large unit advantage. It can become difficult for enemies to overcome that. It's pretty strong, that one. Abyssal Flames is a decent spell as well. It's a bit costly at 150, but it does have a unique advantage over other spells in that it hits the target province, then all adjacent provinces. This means if your enemies have split their armies up over multiple provinces, which is generally one way to avoid spells like this, you can hit the target province they're in, then all adjacent ones around that, so their 3 armies always get hit. Then of course it transforms the terrain into desolate terrain. Now that does matter a lot, because desolate terrain has a very big advantage if you're playing a demon build, especially a melee demon build, because desolate terrain just tends to be very flat, open, hard to defend against melee on, and this just generally makes it, well, let's say, pretty hard for your opponent to find a formation that you're not just gonna be able to fly up a bunch of war breeds, surround, and beat the crap out of them on. Yeah, that's all I have to say. It's maybe not the best terraforming / damage / world map spell, but it's certainly not a bad one. I would say it's a firmly an okay one. Demonic summoning is okay, I guess. So you target a free city vassal, summon 2 random fiends you control. One will be tier 3 and the other will be tier 4. Then the vassal loses a vassalage phase, which is bad, and then loses a population. I'm not sure you care about the population of a vassal, but the vassalage phase can be annoying. Then you can't use it on any vassal denying tribute, meaning they're really annoyed at you. It's kind of weird, and it's like very specific how you have to use it, and it's very constricted, and it's not really giving you even the best units. 2 random fiends can be okay with the new infernal tricksters. Is that what they're called? I think those do count as fiends. So if I look at infernal fiend and accursed fiend, yeah, so there we go, the accursed fiend. The new accursed fiends do count, so you can get the accursed trickster and the accursed blade by this, which is okay. The only problem is you get the infernal fiends from it. They're not really that strong, but it's not the best part of the tome, but it's certainly not terrible. Fight for power can be interesting. 2 fiend units of the same unit tier and target army fight each other. One dies and the other transforms into a fiend with 1 tier higher level than before. So you put 2 tier 4 fiends into an army, they kill each other, and then you get a tier 5, which can either be a Balor or a Calamity Dragon now. It kind of sucks that you can't consistently make it a Balor, and they probably should have just made it consistently be a Balor, but a Calamity Dragon's not bad. If you haven't gone Tome of Calamity and you get a Calamity Dragon to just sit on your back row, that's not exactly a terrible thing. It's just I think a lot of people prefer the consistency of Balor. And that's this tome. So we have a building that's okay. I mean, it does count as a teleporter, so if you're going to get a teleporter anyway, well, now you can get a teleporter that allows you to construct units. You can construct 2 tier 4 units, fight for power, make that into hopefully a Balor. Demonic summoning is whatever. Abyssal Flames is decent world map. This is good for defending gremlin ambushers, and Demonkin is actually a pretty decent transformation type, especially if you're hitting multi-hit. Frenzy can stack up pretty quickly. And remember, that does affect your heroes, which, you know, can make them quite powerful. Now, Tome of Calamity, I've gone back and forth on. When I first looked at Tome of Calamity, I thought it was the most broken tome ever. The more I look at it, the more I see it's an okay tome. It's good. The main thing about Tome of Calamity, it's mostly useful for making ranged units not suck. Before Tome of Calamity, there were very few options to make ranged units not suck. Now, Accursed Projectiles gives a lot of damage to ranged units so that they don't suck. Additionally, because it affects all ranged units for once, this is actually a decent way to make your battle mages not suck. As I mentioned when I was going over the Shadow tomes, this one is also really good. And then we look over here to Cursed Fiends at giving you a tier 4 battle mage. It's non-racial, but it is a very powerful battle mage coming out here at tier 4 that, especially once you buff it with that tome, will deal a lot of damage. It's a tier 4 unit that for some reason is a battle mage that actually deals real damage. If you can believe it, it's an actual battle mage with actual base damage. That's crazy. I know. I never thought I would see the day. Coming in with 16 damage per attack, that's pretty good. Now, its special ability has 6 range, uses every action, but has a 120% chance of making an enemy go insane. That's really good too. So, Tome of Calamity is probably, in all honesty, the best effect of Tome of Calamity is you're buffing all your range units, and then you're getting a battle mage that's pretty strong and gives any faction the ability to do this. It's all wiggly too. Look at how wiggly it is, right? So, Maddening Phantasm's good. Ghost Fire Bolts are good. Ghost Fire Bolts, I should also mention, a 90% chance of ghost firing an enemy. Pretty strong. Tricky Escape is an ability. You inflict 3 ghost fire on an enemy and teleport back 4. It can be useful for getting out of a tricky situation, Other than that, not really that great. And of course, we have Accursed Bodies. All enemies that hit you have a 30% chance of being hit by ghost fire. Not that amazing. The most powerful effect of this unit is when this unit's total hit points drop to 50% or lower, it creates a clone. The clone does 30% reduced damage and has astral reflection, meaning this unit is a copy of another unit. If the original unit dies, this unit replaces it. So if you're trying to kill this unit and it creates a copy, and then you kill the main unit, then the copy just becomes the main unit. Anyway, it's pretty diabolical and makes this unit actually far tankier than you can imagine. It's also just really, really damaging. Additionally, the copy, despite dealing 30% less damage, can just cast its own Maddening Phantasm, or if you've gotten it, Finger of Death. So the copy unit can also be really good at CCing. The Accursed Trickster is actually just really good. Even for being non-racial, it's just really good. So that, in effect, I think is actually the strongest part of the Tome of Calamity. Before I get into anything else, that's just the strongest aspect of it. Now, how do you build the Accursed Trickster? Of course, you have to get the Accursed Shrine. When placed, alter terrain into Desolate. Then each ruined province nearby gives you 3 of each resource, which can be good or bad depending on how you build for it. Some people like it, really depends. Then you're allowed to draft Accursed Ogres, Accursed Blades, and Accursed Tricksters. Accursed Tricksters, as I mentioned, are probably the most important part here. So, what else does this tome do? We get the Ritual of Calamity, which is a siege project. It does 5 fortification damage, which is fine. All defenders get a stack of Ghost Fire, which isn't really that amazing. All towers and battlements are destroyed, which is pretty strong actually. And then 2 Accursed Ogres appear on the attacker's side, which can be decent as well to just give you a bunch more action economy. They're not really that amazing, but you just get more units who hit pretty hard on a charge. So it's actually, yeah, I mean, for tier 2 units, they hit pretty hard, I should say. So Ritual of Calamity is kind of a decent siege project. If enemies built really good towers or battlements or anything like that, you can just crash them. So Comet of Calamity is pretty strong. Enemy units suffer 30 damage in a 2 hex radius, which is a pretty big radius, and then have a 50% chance of being frozen. Then also get 2 stacks of Ghost Fire. So Comet of Calamity is a pretty decent magic nuke, only 30, but then you have a 50% chance of freezing enemies. That's a huge chance overall. Once you hit all enemies, it's just a huge chance of inflicting frozen at 2 or even 3 enemies. And then the Ghost Fire just allows you to do more dots. So Comet of Calamity is a really strong spell. Yeah. Desecrate Land is a world map spell. You target a province, you turn it into a ruins, and then grant resource rewards and alignment as if it was pillaged, and then you alter terrain into Desolate. That can kind of combo with a Cursed Shrine to ruin your own provinces, and then kind of get the bonuses for pillaging them. You can also use it to enemy provinces. And then this can proc if you have bonuses or some racial or some advantage. If you have some racial advantage or some spell, if you've done something throughout the game to get a bonus to pillaging enemies, this does it. And then of course there's also like a backup way to just become like pure evil. I don't know if you haven't managed to do it. It's okay. It's a firmly, honestly, I'm gonna call it kind of underwhelming, but it's fine, I guess. Accursed Armors. Now this buffs all your melee units with 2 defense, so it's pretty good at making you tankier, depending on what you're fighting. If you're fighting Warbreeds, you're going to be a lot tankier. If you're fighting Pyro Templars, you'll be a little bit tankier, or maybe not, depending on what they did. But you just get a free 2 defense, and then it's on all your melee, so it's pretty good. When a melee attack hits you, you have a 30% chance of afflicting them with Ghost Fire and a 30% chance of afflicting them with Misfortune. So Cursed Armors, it's not exactly amazing, but it's not exactly bad either. I would say it's firmly good. You're getting it in a tome that's good anyway, so it's pretty good. As a whole, I would say Tome of Calamity is still a good tome, but it went from what I would say auto-pick best tome in the game to if you're using range, or you need some range, or you've just been building for battle mages, then Tome of Calamity is an auto pick. If you've been building mostly melee, then Accursed Armors can be good at what you're fighting, but Tome of Chaos Channeling can also be pretty decent as well, which I'll go into later. The last thing this tome has is the Summon Calamity Dragon. Now, Calamity Dragon is pretty decent. I would say as time went on, I've thought less and less of them, but they're still pretty decent. They get a 8 range hit for 40 damage, afflicting Ghostfire. As the game goes on, this is going to get resisted more and more, and because it's a mythic damage, you can't really increase this unit's damage. Or sorry, because it's a mythic unit, you can't really increase their damage. So, as the game goes on, it's going to do less and less damage, and using your whole tier 5 unit's turn to do like 20 to 25 damage is not really that amazing. If an enemy gets in melee with you, you also, you're not really going to be doing that much. Their special ability is Force Mask Calamity, so you link to target unit and inflict it with Mask of Calamity. Whenever this unit gets hit, the unit that you've afflicted with it suffers 10 damage, 5 fire, 5 frost, and then they get Ghost Fire. For using your entire turn, it can kind of be good preemptively. If you know your unit is about to be annihilated, then you put it on an enemy unit, and then that enemy unit will get hit pretty hard as you die. It's okay. It's no Mask of Prosperity. Prosperity Dragon is just way better than this one, but it's pretty good. Now, the real reason to use this unit is the Ghostfire Storm. You cast Ghostfire Storm, and then 3 enemy units suffer 10 fire damage, 10 frost damage. You get 2 extra effects of Ghostfire. They can, of course, resist that. And then it repeats at the start of your turn for 3 turns. So Ghostfire Storm does a lot of damage, especially throughout the turns. Calamity Dragon can just do a lot of damage to enemies, and yeah, the Calamity Dragon is mostly the Ghostfire Storm Dragon. Everything else it does is pretty mediocre, especially for a tier 5 unit, but Ghostfire Storm is just a good way to dot up a lot of enemies, do a lot of damage, etc, etc. Then of course it is the Accursed Body, Draconic Rage. Now, I do not believe Draconic Rage affects Ghostfire Storm. In case you thought of that, I think it counts as a world map spell. Or sorry, not world map, in combat spell. Combat enchantment, if we want to call it that. So, yeah, just in case you were thinking there might be some synergy there. Calamity Dragon's fine. He went from like, I would say Calamity Dragon went from like, everyone should have him because it's so good, to my current feelings are now, he's good. Like, if you can get him, he's fine. Overall, Tome of Calamity, it's still a good tome. It's just not like auto pick. Yeah. Now, Tome of Chaos Channeling. This tome is I'm going to say Tome of Calamity was kind of seemingly created to replace Chaos Channeling. Or the other tome it seemingly was made to replace was Tome of the Crucible because of Lava Burst and Meteor Arrows. But there's still some definite advantages to Tome of Chaos Channeling. Now, you don't get a building because no Chaos gets to have buildings. Just don't ask. I don't know why. You summon Magma Spirit, which is cool, I guess. Tier 4 tome summoning a tier 3 battle mage. Cool, I guess. The main aspect of this is the minor race transformation, Scion of Flame. This gives you 4 fire resist, Fiery Wake, which I'm not even going to describe it again. I think I've done it a few times, and immunity to burning. So Scion of Flame, I would say this is a definite hard counter tome if an enemy is going Cleansing Flame tome. This seems to be one of the only counters to Cleansing Flame, and indefinite countering Pyre Templar. Now, the only problem is, you know, Cleansing Flame tome can also just go Scion of Flame, but here's the advantage. If both you and Cleansing Flame have gone Scion of Flame, then you're overall winning because you're resisting way more of the Cleansing Flame. You can't be debuffed with Burning from the Flame Blast champion, so they can't activate that 20% damage. Pyre Templars themselves have a bit of base damage and fire as well, so this is actually a really good tome to beat Cleansing Flame. Now, this tome does have some other things, surely. I just haven't found any. Fan the Inferno is definitely a spell. All enemy units take 5 fire damage and are afflicted with burning. This is really not that good. I guess the idea is that this synergizes hard with the Tome of Pyromancy with Searing Blades, so you can make all enemies take damage. It's not that hard to find some spell or some way to make enemies burning. Cleansing Flame can do AoE to light the ground on fire. So I guess if you desperately need to get enemies on fire, then Fan the Infernal can be good, I guess. It's just like, wow, here's a tier 4 spell using 40 of my combat casting to do very mediocre damage. That's all I have to say. Sacrificial Slaughter. A target friendly unit explodes and enemy units within 2 hexes suffer 20 fire damage plus 5 fire damage per tier of the sacrificed unit, then gain 1 random negative effect per tier of the sacrificed unit. This spell can be good or bad. You can blow up a friendly Warbreed, maybe that got damaged a lot and doesn't maybe have a turn to live. If you blow up a Warbreed, enemies take 40 fire damage in an AoE plus 4 random negative status effects. This can be okay. I think it's cost a little bit aggressively. At 100 mana and 40 combat casting, this is cast as if this is some huge game-changing spell that's like won the battle single-handedly, right? But it's just not. Much like Fan the Inferno, it just seems to be cost a bit too aggressively high and isn't really worth it. Although it can be good, of course, if you hit a lot of enemies with a Warbreed and your random negative status effects have hit good modifiers, then it could be good. I think the intent was maybe it combos with Tome of Pandemonium and Vessels of Chaos. So you hit Sacrificial Slaughter, they get hit with all these negative status effects, and boom, you blow them up with your other units, which, sure, hypothetically that could work. Golden Horde, you summon a full army of random non-scout tier 1 units, and then you pillage an enemy province. The best use of this that I can think of is to get a tempo advantage on enemies, in a way, so that you pillage somewhere and then you send that army away, so they need to build an army as well to go stop you from pillaging their back end. I think that's probably the best use of it. At 300 mana and 300 world casting points, you're asking a lot of my late game world casting points to do this. It's not bad, it's just going to be in a position where it's going to be hard to justify using this. I think it's the best way to put it. Yeah. Infernal Focus is definitely, it's another unit enchantment. Now it affects battle mages, supports, skirmishers, and range units, which is very limiting and not really, it seems to be a battle mage buff thing. It gives you Infernal Might, where base attacks have +1 fire damage, which is great because it doesn't affect the actual AoE of my battle mages. Again, super cool. Can stack up to 5 times. Now that's a good part. Now, I guess the idea here is your battle mages are going to shitload of damage on Infernal Might. So each time a unit dies, you stack it. It stacks up to 5 times, up to 5 damage. Now, the battle does need to have a lot of deaths for this to start stacking. Now, it doesn't affect combat summons, towers, or siegecraft units anymore, which is very limiting. But units will slowly build up a lot of morale and start doing a lot of damage. Of course, that's 5 damage, doubled for non-repeating attacks. So this can affect your range units quite highly. The only problem is, boy, who's using these kinds of units? Maybe you could combo it with Tome of Calamity, and maybe I don't know. It just, I don't know. The main point of chaos channeling is just to get Scion of Flame. Once again, we're running into another tome that doesn't give a building and has like 1 good effect. I don't know, man. It's just, chaos channeling is firmly underwhelming. I'm going to put it in a different way. It's not bad because Scion of Flame can definitely hard counter some tomes, but using the entire tier 4 tome to counter some builds is a tough ask. If it had other good things, I think it would be better, but it's all kind of, yeah. Now, Tome of the Chaos Lord. This is my tier 5 tome, and it has a lot of really good things and a lot of really bad things in it. So let's talk about it then. The most powerful aspect of this tome, which we'll mention outright right immediately, is Demonic Onslaught. All attacking units get killing momentum and hastened for 3 turns, which is really, 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 really strong. Killing momentum gives you back an action point whenever you kill a unit, and hastened, as we've mentioned a lot, makes you really, really fast, and you get an additional retaliation. So Demonic Onslaught is really, really powerful. Just really powerful, actually. There doesn't seem to be any downside to this. It's just really, really, really strong. Incite Rebellion is a siege project that does 6 fortification damage. It does have the downside that we're at a tier 5 tome getting a siege project. However, what the siege project does is, after 1 turn in battle, 3 random non-hero units are mind controlled until the end of the battle. This basically makes it impossible to beat. So Incite Rebellion is a siege project that basically does not allow an enemy army. It doesn't allow an enemy to actually beat you in sieges anymore, unless they have lots of cleansing. There's like no way to stop the enemy from winning the siege. They would need lots of cleansing and a lot of power. I think it could hypothetically be done. In fact, I think it could definitely be done with lots of cleansing. You're just fighting an uphill battle really hard. Like, man, it would be really rough for you to beat Incite Rebellion. Summon Balor summons a Balor. I'll get into that in a second. Now, Call Forth Avatar Chaos. Man, this one is a very interesting spell. Very, very, very interesting. So what it does is summon an avatar of your ruler in a battle. The avatar has the same abilities as your ruler and spawns with full action points. All fiends then also get 10 morale. You can't use it in water battles, and you can't use it in battles where your ruler is present. So, in other words, once you have Tome of the Chaos Lord, your ruler will be in every single battle. The downside is, your ruler can't be in the battle by himself for this to affect you. But this does give you an additional unit, and probably the most powerful unit in the game, in your game, at the very least, in your army. Your ruler will probably be the single most powerful unit. So that's a pretty good summon spell. You can also use it, potentially, multiple times. I don't think they've stopped you from doing that. And importantly, what this does is a lot of ways to stop enemies from casting spells is to kill their ruler. Once their ruler is dead, they can't cast spells. But this allows you to not have your ruler in a battle, still continue to cast spells, and then also get your ruler into the battle. And then even if they kill your ruler in the battle, you just summon him again. So this one can actually be really, really strong. And again, it stops enemies. You can have your ruler in the battle while preventing enemies from killing your ruler to massively debuff you. So it's just a very interesting, in my opinion, very powerful spell. I don't really see any downside of this other than the first turn of spellcasting, you would have to use this. But because you're summoning them with full action points and full power, especially if you had like a tanky ruler, you could just summon this into their backline, demolish a bunch of units, and then they would have to kill your ruler. Probably the single most powerful summon spell in the game. Yeah. So between these two, you have a lot of power from Tome of the Chaos Lord. In fact, I should probably adjust this to be a bit higher on the tier. Yeah, I was just thinking about it. So, Tome of the Chaos Lord, no real downside. Amazing siege project, amazing spell, and second amazing spell. Now you have the Summon Balor. The Balor has power creeped, I would say, a little bit, but they're definitely still a very strong unit. So we got 150 HP, 6.5 stats here, a pretty tanky tier 5 unit. They're weak to Spirit and Frost, which of course makes them, they're definitely going to suffer from having that, right? They do 20 damage per hit, which is a chance to burn enemies, and they get strengthened on hit. Realistically, actually not that damaging, really not that strong even, but their other effects kind of make up for it. Now we have Sunder the Earth. Now in a 4-hex line, it's a bit janky to use, but you hit all enemies, you deal 40 damage, and then you sunder enemies' defense. It's okay. Once again, it's not the greatest, but the rest of it kind of makes up for it. Chaos Brand is an ability usable up to 4 range and has 1 action point cost. Enemy unit sustains damage, automatically becomes berserk until the end of the battle. So this forces an enemy unit to either be in range of you to berserk. Now berserk isn't insane. He generally won't attack his allies, but sometimes the game gets a bit screwy. But this allows you to force an enemy unit to not be able to take his turns by his own choice. He's just going to run up and attack an enemy. So this allows you to break an enemy, let's say, formation, and forces them to run into you at the start of their turn. Basically, it's a kind of form of taunt. Then, if the unit is not a hero, it turns into a tier 1 Infernal Fiend into your control upon its death. This is good for, once again, preventing enemies from reviving their allies, because it turns into the Infernal Fiend, or just getting an extra unit. It's just generally useful. It's kind of hard to argue with it. It's just generally useful and can generally be really frustrating for enemies to try to deal with, because you probably have a lot of war breeds, and then forcing them out of position from range in addition to that can just be really irritating to deal with. Now it does have Corpse Explosion. When this unit dies, units in a 2 hex radius suffer 30 fire damage, halved for friendly units, and then become burning. So this unit can actually get, pretty decent dots on enemies and kind of punish them, but, realistically speaking, it's not really that strong. Siege Breaker, pretty typical. Overall, I would say it's basically Chaos Brand, and it's a little bit of AoEing. It's a pretty decent unit. It comes out of a tier 5 tome, and it's only a tier 5 unit. So like a lot of other people can get tier 5 units out of tier 4 tomes. But, it's not a bad unit by any stretch of imagination. It's not as good as maybe Reaper or, units like that. But it's still a pretty good unit. Yeah, I would definitely say it's a pretty good unit. So in total, I would say the Tome of the Chaos Lord is actually a pretty good tier 5 tome. There's other tier 5 tomes that are definitely weaker than this one. But there's definitely some tier 5 tomes that are maybe a bit stronger than this one. I would say it's pretty strong as a whole, though. So then let's look as a whole, and I've been adjusting this as I'm going through here. As a whole, then how would I rank these? S+, I'm going to put Cleansing Flame, because Cleansing Flame is just generally really, really, really strong. Chaos Channeling, I'm going to put it S. I decided to put Chaos Channeling a bit up, because I think it's a bit stronger than people think. Yeah. Dreadnought, I'm going to put into A tier. I think Dreadnought is still really good when it's good. It's just, as I'm looking through the Chaos tomes, it doesn't really have any synergy with any of the Chaos tomes. So, a lot of its strength is kind of hard to explain. If you want to know why it's strong, you go look at the Materium. Devastation is really good because, it's just good. Demon Gate is good because turning you into demons is good. It's still just which these are good and not. We just went through them. So Demon Gate's still good because you turn into demons. You can potentially get Balords and stuff from that earlier on. Demons are still pretty strong. Making your race flying is still pretty strong. Calamity is good because you sit one Calamity Dragon in the back. He summons a storm that just does good global damage that forces enemies to either have a lot of healing or come into you. Having one Calamity Dragon is just pretty strong, but to my knowledge, you can get Calamity Dragons from Demon Gate at this point, which does reduce the need to get it if you're going with Demon Gate. But then your range units are really strong and your melee units will be a bit tankier, and you have a really good combat spell. So Tome of Calamity is still just really, 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 really strong. Tome of the Horde is just really good for rushing people. And it does scale a decent bit by getting the Spawnkin. Tome of Revelry is just generally good. It's a tier 2 tome. It gives you more damage. It gives you more morale. By default, you don't need to do anything. You just cast it and boom, my race gets more morale for the entire rest of the game. And then, of course, you get the more experience, which you put on your heroes. And then you can get maybe a level advantage on your enemies. Tome of Pyromancy, I'm going to put B tier because I think as time goes on, it's gotten less and less relevant. Now, when it's good, it's really, 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 really good, of course. But I would say over time, fire damage is getting less and less useful as more and more people are going with Pyro Templars. And it just doesn't really do a lot other than enchant your units. Yeah. Tome of Dragons is fine. I mean, it's got the dragons, but it's really not that amazing. Transforming your race into dragons is just good. I mean, it's got the natural regeneration. It's got the draconic rage, which affects your heroes. It's good, I guess. Tome of Chaos Channeling can counter one tome, the Sacred Flame. Other than that, I just don't really think it does that much good. Tome of Pandemonium, boy, doesn't... I mean, it gives... I mean, it just... What does it do in realistically, right? Like, it's just shitty Tome of Corruption. And then down here in Evolution, we have... Evolution is terrible. I do not think highly of Evolution. In fact, I'm going to be real with you. I think I'm putting Evolution in E tier. I just don't think Evolution is strong. I think you're playing the game on hard mode to try to go Evolution. It's just not good. I'm not saying you can't use it. I'm not saying it's impossible. I could definitely lose to someone going Tome of Evolution, but they'd be going uphill the entire game, having to try to rely on it. Tome of Mayhem? Tome of Mayhem. Tome of Mayhem just doesn't really do a lot. It's directly... It feels like a tome that you're like trolling your enemy rather than trying to win the game. That's the best way to put it. You're trolling your enemy rather than trying to win the game. So I just don't think much of that. Okay. So that's all the Chaos Affinity tomes. What's up next? What are we doing next for this channel? Well, I'm probably going to do Astral Affinity, obviously. Then I might do the Affinity track. I'm thinking of doing that. After that, Path of Exile 2 is coming out next week. Obviously, I do intend to continue Age of Wonders 4 and stuff like that, because you guys seem to really enjoy it. Path of Exile 2, I'm not really that good at ARPGs, and I also get really bored by them. But I am looking forward to this one, because it does look like it could be pretty fun. So we'll probably do some videos on that. Additionally, I played a bit of Supervive. Again, I think I mentioned this. I might do a video talking about Supervive, because it's definitely got some things. I think it might be good to do a video on other stuff. Supervive is probably outside of this channel's, at this point, what this channel likes. But, you know, sometimes just doing videos on random stuff could be fine. That's about it. If anyone has any other ideas for what you'd like me to go over, I did do the form trait video because a lot of you guys were asking for that. So, yeah, if you guys have any ideas, suggestions, anything like that, make sure to ask in the comments. Just be like, could you do a video on this? I'm probably, most of them are going to do a video maybe on early game stuff, because a lot of you guys want help on early game, and I think that's something that I'm reasonably sure that I'm competent enough in that I could do a video on that. Just kind of generally going over the early game, and maybe going to like an hour, just kind of like how you can like replay the early game again and again to talk about, you know, oh, so here you do this and oh, this went wrong. Oh, here you do this and this went wrong, you know, stuff like that. So thank you all for watching. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, everybody. And as always, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And thank you guys for supporting this channel a lot. It's meant a lot to me. So thank you for that. I appreciate it a lot. So thank you guys.